The Enduro 3 might not be Garmin's flagship watch, but I think it's one of the best watches that Garmin currently has to offer in the action adventure category. Its price point is quite a bit better than the flagship Fenix 8, and it even has better solar charging and battery. There are some other minor differences in favor of the Fenix 8, which I discussed in more detail in my Fenix 8 review, which you might want to check off after this video, but spec-wise, for the most part at least, it's basically a repackaged Fenix 8. However, will it perform as well as the Fenix 8? That's what we'll test in this video by systematically and scientifically testing the heart rate tracking accuracy, the sleep stage tracking performance, and the GPS tracking consistency. But before getting to the test results, I should mention that I really like that the Enduro 3 has a fabric velcro strap. It's not the best looking honestly, but it's breathable, and since it's infinitely adjustable, it likely gives the watch the best chance of performing well. Also, you should realize that even with a well-fitting strap like this, large and heavy adventure watches like the Enduro 3 and similarly of course the Fenix 8 are still at a significant disadvantage compared to, for instance, smaller and lighter watches like the watches from the Forerunner series of Garmin. The higher weight of the Enduro 3 will make it move around more on my wrist, likely inducing a bunch of extra noise in the heart rate signal that lighter watches from the Forerunner series don't have to deal with. But let's get to the results, and let's start off by checking if the Enduro 3 could track my heart rate during a number of different exercises. And let's start with one of the easiest exercises for a watch to track: indoor cycling. Indoor cycling is easy, or at least easy-ish, since there's relatively little motion and also not that much tension on my arm. And this plot right here shows you an overview of the 7 indoor cycling sessions I did, where I compare it to a reference ECG chest strap from Polar, which is along the horizontal axis and which can generally record my heart rate very accurately. And on the vertical axis is the Garmin Enduro 3, and if the measurements would perfectly agree, all values should be along this blue line right here. And as you can see, most points are on or close to the blue line, which is good. There's only a few deviating points, so there's a few above it right here. Mostly there's some below it right here, and this means that sometimes at least the Enduro 3 detected a too low heart rate. But overall this doesn't look too bad, and we can also see that based on the correlation, which is this R value up here, which is 0.92, which is pretty decent. It's not amazing, but it definitely seems to be good enough under most circumstances. But let's take a look at the individual rides to see if there's any weird artifacts going on. And here we have the first example interval spinning session, where you can see exactly why it's sometimes detected a too low heart rate. Now along the horizontal axis as always we have the clock time, and my heart rate is along the vertical axis, with in blue-green my heart rate according to the reference device, and in red my heart rate according to the Garmin Enduro 3. And as you can see, this looks quite good, though sometimes there's a slight delay in it picking up on a decrease or increase in my heart rate. So for instance right here there's a delay in picking up on that increase, also right here a slight delay, and sometimes there's a delay in picking up on a decrease in my heart rate like right here, but this is nothing bad, this will be good enough for me. Also this second ride looks quite okay, though right here I didn't fully detect that dip in my heart rate, but otherwise it looks quite good. Also this ride looks quite good, again a slight delay right here, but nothing much to complain about. Also right here a slight delay in picking up on a decrease, and also an increase right here, and here again a slight delay in picking up on a decrease. But this is all really minor, so this will be good enough. Also right here only this peak wasn't fully detected, otherwise quite good. Also right here nothing to complain about, and also this example looks quite good. So overall this looks quite decent for indoor cycling. But let's now compare these results to that of many other devices I tested in the past. And this plot right here provides some context by comparing the Enduro 3 against many of the other devices I tested in the past. Along the horizontal axis we have the correlation value we were looking at before, so that R value, and we want that value to be as close to 1 as possible. And on the vertical axis I ordered the watches from worst to best, so the further to the right and the higher the device is, the better is its correlation with the reference device. And the Enduro 3 is marked in red right here. So it's somewhere in the middle of all devices. It's definitely not bad, so there's quite a few bad performing watches down here, but it's also not amongst the best devices. Still, a correlation of 0.92 isn't bad at all, but let's zoom in a bit so we can read those labels better. And that zoomed in view is displayed right here. So these are just the watches with a correlation of 0.8 or higher. And as you can see, amongst these, the Enduro 3 is still doing quite okay. It's actually quite close to also the Fenix 7 and the Fenix 8. So the Fenix 8 might have done a tiny bit worse. So it's difficult to say if this is significant. And if there is a difference, I think this is mostly due to the different strap, which is a bit less ideal for the Fenix 8, at least the stock strap I got with it. If you look at some of the better performing watches, watches. These are mostly Apple watches, as regular viewers will know, and also the Pixel Watch 3. Some Huawei devices do quite well, and also the Amazfit T-Rex 3, which is a bit of an alternative to the Enduro 3 and also quite a bit cheaper, is doing quite well. I cannot really explain why right here the Epix 2 Pro and Fenix 7 Pro did better than the Enduro 3. So these have the same sensor. As I also explained in my Fenix 8 video, it could just be that I tested this in a warmer climate, and this warmer climate might have benefited the blood flow to my arms, giving a cleaner signal in my testing of the Fenix 7 Pro and Epix 2 Pro, and giving the Enduro 3 a harder time. Still, I think all of these did quite well, so this would be good enough for me for indoor cycling. If you want perfection, then you need to go for an Apple Watch or a Pixel Watch. But otherwise, I think the Enduro 3 is good enough. And of course, the Enduro 3 has a much better battery life than the Apple Watch and the Pixel Watch. Okay, that's pretty decent performance, I would say, from the Enduro 3. It's nothing groundbreaking and there are some minor issues, but generally it's good enough for me. I would say it's in the same ballpark as the Fenix 8 and potentially even a tiny bit better, though it's difficult to say if it's actually significantly better. It would make some sense to me that the strap that comes with the Enduro 3 is indeed giving it a slight edge over the silicone strap that comes with the Fenix 8. But let's move on to some new results. Let's take a look at another relatively easy exercise for most watches to track running indoors. But before doing that, do you like these videos? Do you want to get early access to results? And do you want to support me in making these videos? Then please consider becoming a YouTube member. I've been running this channel next to my full-time job as a scientist for several years, but I honestly need a bit of help to keep it going. So if you want to support me in paying my editor Alex and get some perks in return, check out the link up here or down here. But back to the testing. And here you can see the results for 2 indoor running sessions that I did. And this looks really good, honestly. Almost all points are on or close to the blue line. They're not perfectly close to it, so there's often like a 5 BPM deviation, maybe especially here in the higher heart rate range. But overall, this looks quite good. Also, the correlation is quite high at 0.99, so nothing to complain about here. I do want to look at the individual runs because it could be that these deviations are still somewhat of a systematic bias. So let's take a look at the individual runs. So here we have that first example indoor run with again the Enduro 3 in red. And as you can see, it basically followed along perfect with the reference device. Only right here did it struggle a little bit to detect that full dip in my heart rate, but this is really minor. So I would be perfectly happy with these results. And also this second run looks really good. So for indoor running, the Enduro 3 doesn't seem to struggle at all, but let's still compare it against the competition. So here we have that overview for indoor running, and as you can see, I only tested a few devices for indoor running so far, and most of them have quite an easy time. So the majority actually have a correlation above 0.95, so all of them are doing quite well. But the Enduro 3 is among some of the best performers here. So it's doing about the same as the Fenix 8, only the Apple Watch Series 10 is doing a tiny bit better. But otherwise, I'm really happy with this result. Still, it is important to realize that this is a relatively easy exercise and most watches here have no problems at all. Those results make me pretty happy, I would say. I don't know about you. So far for indoor cycling and indoor running, the Enduro 3 is doing well enough. Given the weight of the Enduro 3, that's actually not so bad. I might be a bit biased here since Garmin watches sometimes struggle detecting my heart rate on me. So compared to some of the other brands, their performance generally isn't amazing, but the Enduro 3 is doing well enough, so this will be good enough for me. Next, let's make things quite a bit more difficult by testing the Enduro 3 during outdoor running. Now this should only be a bit more difficult compared to indoor running for a watch to track my heart rate, but why would it be more difficult? Well, first of all, there might be more light leakage into the sensor from sunlight, there might be more changes in pace, which could also confuse the heart rate sensor, and also the colder temperatures in winter might restrict the blood flow to my wrist. So let's see if the Enduro 3 had any issues for outdoor running. And this is the overview for running outside, and this already looks a little bit worse compared to what we saw for running indoor. So there's quite a few more points away from the blue line now, not drastically far away, but still a bit further away. That also means that the correlation is a bit lower now at 0.91, so more comparable to what we saw for cycling indoors. Again, this might be good enough, but we really need to take a look at the individual runs here to see what's going on. I was only able to do 2 runs, so a relatively small data set, but let's still have a look. And here we have the results for the first run with again the Enduro 3 in red. And this looks quite okay, especially for the second 2/3 of the run. It was basically perfect. Only in the beginning it struggled. Maybe this had to do with the cold temperatures, so my arm was still warming up a bit as I started running. It struggled a bit more here, detected a too low heart rate. This would still be acceptable to me. This second run though doesn't look quite as good. Here I struggled quite a bit more. Basically for the first full half of the run, it detected a too low heart rate. So it never detected the peaks in my heart rate. Then again, the second half is okay. So maybe again, my wrist warming up a bit, getting a better heart rate as my wrist is getting warmer and the blood flow is increasing. That's just a hypothesis, but that could be what's going on here. Of course, I was wearing gloves and also a long sleeve, so I would have hoped it would have warmed up faster, but I'm not sure if that's the actual cause. These are the data and I just want to show them to you. So I'm not sure if this will be good enough for me. I would like to do a few more runs to see how consistent this result is. So also check out some other reviewers, but let's again put these results into context. And here we have that overview. Similar to before, we want the devices to be as far to the top right as possible. And as you can see, just based on correlation, the Enduro 3 isn't doing that bad. It's somewhere in the middle, maybe upper middle class of devices. If we compare it, for instance, to the Fenix 8, it actually isn't that far off and potentially a bit better, but it's not as good as some of the top performing watches like Apple watches and also some Huawei devices in the Pixel Watch 3, which I forgot to put in this overview, but also did really well. And also the Amazfit T-Rex 3 I tested recently does do better than the Enduro 3. I think compared to Garmin devices like the Enduro 3, the T-Rex 3 does miss the Garmin ecosystem. So even though the running tracking might be better, you do miss out on most of those benefits of the Garmin ecosystem. That still might make me prefer an Enduro 3 over the T-Rex 3, but it's really personal to your needs. Overall, this is okay performance of the Enduro 3, though based on that second run, I'm not sure if this will be good enough for me. It's somewhat borderline. I want a bit more data, but I'm curious, what do you think? But let us know in the comments below. Let's now move on to some other exercises. Now, out of all results so far, this is the first major issue I've had with the Enduro 3. The fact that it was clearly detecting a too low heart rate for the first part of that second run isn't great. It could be a sign of cadence lock, for instance, or maybe the weight of the Enduro 3 is just causing quite a bad signal quality. I would be curious to hear if anybody else has any experience with the Enduro 3 for outside running. If you do, let us know in the comments below. Next, let's take a look at one of the hardest exercises for a watch to track, cycling outside. But first, if you're finding these videos interesting, it really helps me get access to new devices sooner and helps me reach more people if you like this video and subscribe to the channel. Pressing those two buttons really makes a huge difference, and commenting of course also helps. I would really appreciate it. But let's get back to the testing. And here we have that overview for biking outside for a total of 18 bike rides, so quite a lot of data. And as you can see, this doesn't look quite as good as the results we had for indoor cycling or indoor running. There's quite a big deviation away from the blue line now. Yes, most points are still close to or on the blue line, especially here in the higher heart rate range, it seems to be doing quite okay. But here in the medium to low heart rate range, there's quite a few points below the blue line, indicating that in those moments, the Garmin Enduro 3 detected a too low heart rate. So I'm not really sure what's going on here. It's not terribly bad, but it's not as good as I would have hoped. Also, the correlation, so that R value we were looking at before, is quite a bit lower now at 0.81. So let's take a look at the individual bike rides to see what's actually going on here. I want to start with some of the newest bike rides I did and then move back to some of the older ones. So here we have the Enduro 3 in red and a reference device in blue-green. And as you can see, the Enduro 3 somewhat tracked my heart rate correctly, but it missed a lot of the details in my heart rate. So here, for instance, missed the peak in my heart rate. And also here in the beginning, for some reason, detected a way too low heart rate and also missed some of my heart rate readings. Looking at this second session, we see mostly the same thing. Quite a lot of delays in picking up on an increased heart rate, which probably explains why there were so many points below the blue line in the medium to high heart rate range. Interestingly, for some of the longer rides, like this one right here, it does seem to be doing a bit better. Especially here in the beginning, it tracked my heart rate quite accurately. Of course, for rides like this, there tend to be fewer abrupt changes in my heart rate because there's fewer traffic lights when I'm up in the mountains. But for shorter rides like this, where there's more traffic lights, it does seem to struggle quite a bit. So quite often it has a delay in picking up on that increase in my heart rate. Though this bike ride right here seems a bit better again. This one is also not that bad. Also for this longer ride right here, again, it did quite okay. Only near the end did it struggle a bit more. Then this shorter ride is also okay in the beginning, a bit worse near the end. And also right here, it didn't do that great. So it's really a bit of a mixed bag. Again, similar to what we saw for the Fenix 8. Some rides are okay, some rides are quite bad. And the longer rides on average seem to be a bit better than the shorter rides. So again, maybe the temperature also plays a role here, where for the longer rides, my body is just warmed up and the performance overall is a bit better. But again, speculation. What do you think? Is this good enough? Let's now move on to one of the hardest exercises. But before doing that, let's again put these results into context with again the Enduro 3 marked in red right here. And as you can see, I would say it's again in the upper middle class of devices. It's not the absolute best devices, at least based on correlation, but it's also not terrible. So it really confirms for me this mixed bag of results, with some rides being good, some rides being not so good. But let's zoom in again. So here we have a zoomed in view with the labels a bit bigger, so a bit easier to read. So these are just the watches with a correlation of 0.7 or higher. And as you can see, the Enduro 3 is close to, for instance, the Venue 3, but also the Forerunner 255, the Vivo Smart 5, the Epix 2 Pro, the Fenix 7 Pro, the Venue 7 Plus. So close to a lot of other Garmin devices as well. So to see the Fenix 8, we actually need to zoom out again a little bit. So the Fenix 8 is right here. So it has a correlation close to 0.7 instead of 0.8. So theoretically, I would have expected both to do about the same, but their weight is slightly different, and also the Fenix 8 had a different strap. So potentially that means that the Enduro 3 did a bit better because of those reasons. I'm not entirely sure if those are the reasons, but those are the only two I can think of that actually make some sense. And as you can see, some of the best devices out there are again different Apple Watches, the Pixel Watch 3 and some Huawei devices. The Amazfit T-Rex 3 right here, which could be an alternative to the Enduro 3, again does a little bit better, though I'm not sure if this difference is actually super significant. If you want to know more about the T-Rex 3, I recently reviewed that and you can find it up here. The Whoop strap is one of my all-round recommendations, a device I use every day myself, but it's very different to a watch, so you have to use your phone to start all the exercises, so it's a bit more limited in that regard. And again, if you want the best heart rate tracking performance, an Apple Watch or a Pixel Watch 3 do really well. Though of course these have really poor battery life compared to something like the Enduro 3. So it really depends on what you're looking for. If you want to be in the Garmin ecosystem and you want to use the Enduro 3 for instance, I would recommend using an external chest strap to track your heart rate, especially for something like biking outside. Maybe for biking inside or running inside it would be good enough to use the Enduro 3 by itself, but for biking outside it's just the most reliable way to get your heart rate and you still get amazing battery life. So that's my overall recommendation. These results so far for cycling outside are the biggest issues I've had with the Enduro 3. It's not the worst I've ever seen, but I would still like to see better performance. This is a case where I would really start using an external chest strap. So as we saw on my longer rides with fewer abrupt changes in my heart rate, it did mostly seem to be able to track my general patterns in heart rate. But let's now take a look at the hardest exercise for a watch to track: weightlifting. And here we have those results for a total of 3 weightlifting sessions where we definitely see some issues. There's quite a few points even close to this red line right here. So this red line indicates where the watch detects half the actual heart rate it should be detecting, and that happens in some cases or even less than half the actual heart rate. Still, of course, most points are close to the blue line, but the correlation is quite low now at 0.73. But here we really need to take a look at the individual weightlifting sessions to see if this is a significant problem. Here we have the first weightlifting session with again the Garmin Enduro 3 in red. So for the first half here I did legs and I did quite okay, so it was able to track my heart rate accurately, but of course when I'm training legs there's no tension on my arms, so it makes it a lot easier. But the moment I moved to back and biceps it struggled a lot more, so it wasn't able to detect all the peaks in my heart rate. Still, this looks a bit better than I initially expected. Looking at this second session where I only did upper body, it really struggled a lot more, so it wasn't able to fully detect most of the peaks in my heart rate. As you can see, each time I did a set, my heart rate increased, as you can see by the blue line, and the red line wasn't able to follow along that well. This looks quite okay for the first 3 sets. Somehow for the 4th set it really struggled a lot. So here I detected a decrease instead of an increase, which explains those points far away from the blue line, close to the blue line in that overview plot. Overall, this wouldn't be good enough for me. If you want to track your heart rate accurately during weightlifting, honestly, no matter what device you use, I would recommend using an ECG chest strap. But let's see how some of the other devices performed. And you're familiar with this type of overview by now, where we want the devices to be as far to the top right as possible. But as you can see, the Enduro 3 is somewhere in the middle of all devices. Only Apple Watches have a quite high correlation. Other devices, maybe the Pixel Watch 3, some Huawei devices are doing okay-ish as well. But anything below 0.9 is definitely not good enough for tracking your heart rate during weightlifting, and that includes the Enduro 3. Now you should be aware that one reason Apple Watches still get quite a high correlation for weightlifting is that when they detect they have poor heart rate quality, they just drop those heart rate measurements, so it doesn't affect their correlation, but they still might miss those peaks in heart rate. So overall, no matter what device you use and you want to track your heart rate during weightlifting, an ECG chest strap is really the way to go. It gets you the most reliable and accurate heart rate signal. Based on these results for weightlifting, I would say just connect an ECG chest strap to the Enduro 3 if you want reliable heart rate tracking. On the other hand, as we saw for indoor cycling and indoor running, the Enduro 3 seemed to be an okay heart rate tracker, at least on me. But to get a better overview, let's combine all of these results into a single plot. And here we have all those results we just looked at in a single plot, with the 5 different activities along the horizontal axis. So biking inside, biking outside, running inside, running outside, and weightlifting. And those correlations are along the vertical axis. Now all the different devices are indicated by different dots, and specifically the Enduro 3 is indicated by a red dot and a red line. So you can compare them against all the other devices I tested previously. I also indicate the correlation, so that R value we were looking at before, and this percentile or percentage. So we have a 48% right here, and that means that 48% of devices were performing worse than the Enduro 3. So for cycling indoor, it's really in the middle of all devices, but because the correlation is 0.92, it's still quite good. For cycling outside, it is quite a bit worse, so it still did better than about 61% of devices, which is quite okay. But as you saw, cycling outside is just a lot harder, and a correlation of 0.81 might not be good enough for many of you. Then again, for running indoor, it did really well. It's doing better than 85% of devices. And for running outside, even though the percentile here at 59% is similar to the 61% of biking outside, this might be good enough for me, though it still had some issues. Biking outside for sure would not be good enough for me. So I have a correlation of 0.91 for running outside and 0.81 for biking outside. And for weightlifting, as we just saw, it's just not good enough, but most other devices aren't good enough. But how does this compare, for instance, to the Fenix 8? Well, we have those results right here, and overall, I would say they're very similar. Maybe for biking outside, the Enduro 3 did a little bit better than the Fenix 8, but otherwise, most correlations of the Enduro 3 and the Fenix 8 are more or less the same, but the Enduro 3 does tend to be a tiny bit better than the Fenix 8, and I think this might be due to weight or due to the strap that I used. But overall, they're very comparable.
So the heart rate tracker for the Enduro 3 looks okay, though not amazing, I would say. It might be good enough for many of you, but probably not all of you. I would really recommend using an external chest strap like I'm doing now if you want to use Garmin watches for heart rate tracking. At least that's my experience on my body, but of course also check out some other reviewers. But I thought it would be appropriate on a bike ride today on this cold winter day in Vienna to make a point why I still use Garmin watches basically every day. I use them because the ecosystem is very good and the battery life is very good. Basically any ride I go on, I also take a Garmin watch because I know the battery will last. It will track my location accurately and the battery will just last for a long time. And in addition, the ecosystem is really good. I can connect a bunch of different sensors to it. So usually I also have power meters on my bike, unfortunately on my broken bike right now, but I also have a body core temperature sensor, also my indoor trainer and a temperature sensor of the environment. So that way I can collect a lot of data just because I like playing with the data. So even though the heart rate tracking per se might not be the best if you don't use an external chest strap, there's still a bunch of reasons why I use Garmin sensors for tracking my activities. But let's next take a look at the sleep stage tracking performance of the Garmin Enduro 3.
Before doing that, I did want to add one thing. As you saw before, for indoor cycling and indoor running, the Enduro 3 might be good enough, at least the way it performed on me, so a chest strap might not be required there. Also, the results on others might be a bit better or even a bit worse, so always also check out some other reviewers like DC Rainmaker, Desfit, Matt Legrand and Chase the Summit. But let's now take a deep dive into the sleep stage tracking of the Enduro 3. Here you can see an overview of the sleep test results for a total of 6 nights. Now to test the sleep stage tracking performance, I compared the Garmin Enduro 3 against the Z-Max EEG headband, which can actually measure my brain waves. Now this device also has limitations, especially when it comes to detecting awake time, but it will give us a general impression of the sleep stage tracking performance of the Garmin Enduro 3. Now on top are the sleep stages as recorded by the Z-Max EEG device, and on the left are the sleep stages as recorded by the Enduro 3. Now each column here sums to 100%, meaning that we can see what percentage of each of the sleep stages according to the Z-Max was predicted as the sleep stage by the Enduro 3. And if they perfectly agree, all values along the diagonal right here should be 100%. Now first of all, we see that about 74% of what was deep sleep according to the Z-Max was also detected as deep sleep by the Enduro 3, so that's pretty decent. Most confusion in this case was with light sleep, so overall looking pretty good so far. Light sleep agreement is actually also quite good at about 70%, and in this case most confusion was with both deep sleep and REM sleep. REM sleep agreement on the other hand isn't very good, about 37%. So about 37% of what the EEG device said was REM sleep was also detected as REM sleep by the Enduro 3, so quite a low agreement. More of it was actually predicted as being a light sleep instead at about 53%. Now, as I mentioned before, I won't be focusing on awake time because the Z-Max detects a lot of short awake moments that aren't really that interesting, but just for completeness, about 26% of what the Z-Max said was awake time was also awake time according to the Enduro 3. But now we really need to take a look at the individual nights to see what these percentages actually mean. And clearly, looking at the individual nights right here will help us understand it even better, and here you can see the first night I wanted to share with you. On top we have the sleep stages as detected by the ZMax EEG headband. Along the horizontal axis the clock time and my sleep stages on the vertical axis. And on the bottom we have a similar plot but now for the Enduro 3, where now in purple right here I highlight the deep sleep as recorded by the EEG device. And as you can see, I had 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 deep sleep segments, but I would say 3 right here. And all of these were also detected by the Enduro 3. The Enduro 3 just detected some extra deep sleep, so it detected more deep sleep for each of these segments and also some extra deep sleep right here. Overall, this is very reminiscent of what we saw in my review of the Fenix 8, where it detects most of the deep sleep also detected by the EEG device, just some extra deep sleep. And for this second night, we see more or less the same thing, but this was a bit of an interrupted night with some awake moments. So here the EEG device said I had one major deep sleep segment here in the beginning, then some interruptions in the first part of the night, which probably led to me having some more deep sleep later in the night. And most of this was also detected by the Enduro 3, but again, a lot of extra deep sleep was also detected. We can see though that most of the awake moments do somewhat match between the EEG device and the Garmin Enduro 3. Just the EEG device tends to detect too many awake moments, so we won't be focusing on that. And again, as I said, in general, the Enduro 3 tends to detect too much deep sleep. And we can actually do something similar for REM sleep, which is marked in red now right here. So the REM sleep as detected by the EEG device is also marked on the bottom right here on the Enduro 3 plot. And as you can see, 2 out of the 4 REM sleep segments were also detected by the Enduro 3, so this one right here and this one right here. But the other 2, so this one and this one, were missed. So that doesn't look amazing in terms of REM sleep. And also for this second night, which was a bit interrupted here in the beginning, the REM sleep agreement isn't very good. So according to the EEG device, I had one REM sleep segment right here, which wasn't detected by the Enduro 3. This second one somewhat matches, though it's a bit shifted. And this third segment also is only partially detected, and some extra REM sleep is detected as well by the Enduro 3. Overall, there appears to be somewhat of a match in deep sleep, just too much potentially being detected by the Enduro 3, and the REM sleep agreement isn't very good. So overall, this actually looks relatively similar to what we saw for the Fenix 8, which is understandable because I wouldn't expect a big difference in performance. But let's now compare these results to that of many other devices I tested in the past, so you can select the best device out there for you. So this graph right here shows you an overview of the agreement of different watches with different EEG reference devices. Along the horizontal axis, we have the average agreement over the individual sleep stages, and on the vertical axis, we have the agreement of the worst sleep stage. So that means the further to the right and the higher a device is, the better is its agreement with the reference device. Now this overview is slightly complicated because we use different reference devices. The devices marked in blue-purple were tested against polysomnography, which is the gold standard in sleep stage tracking. The devices marked in green were tested against the ZMax EEG headband, so the one we used in this video. And the devices not marked in any color were tested against the Dream 2 EEG headband, which I cannot use at the moment. But overall, the patterns are more or less the same no matter what reference device I used. As you can see, Apple watches appear to be best, and some Chinese devices appear to be worse, like Huawei and Mi Band. And you can see the results for the Garmin Enduro 3 marked in green right here. So overall, it's somewhere in the middle of all devices, and actually quite close to, for instance, the Garmin Fenix 8, the Vivo Active 5, and also other devices like the Venue 3, the Forerunner 165. I think all these devices, including the Enduro 3 and Fenix 8, perform more or less the same from Garmin. So I think Garmin devices probably use the same algorithm. So as long as they receive the same updates, their performance will be more or less the same, because during the night it's relatively easy to measure things like heart rate and movement, which is probably what these devices are based on. So this overall performance of Garmin devices definitely isn't bad. There are worse devices out there, but it's also not amongst the best devices. So for those of you that haven't watched that many videos, the best devices out there tend to be Apple watches, but also the H-Sleep Pod, so the H-Sleep Pod 3 and H-Sleep Pod 4. The Oura Ring is quite good as well, and the Nucor app, now called Sleep 2, is also one of the better performing devices. So those 4 are the top 4. So Oura, H-Sleep, Apple, and Sleep 2. And in the second tier of devices is the Whoop strap and different Fitbit and Google devices. So Google actually owns Fitbit, and all of their devices use the same sleep stage tracking algorithm back to 2017 or 18 already. So if you have an old Fitbit device, it probably still has pretty decent sleep stage tracking. And also the Whoop strap is pretty good. Not quite as good, at least on me, as for instance the Apple Watch and the H-Sleep Pod, but it's a good overall device. As we also saw for heart rate tracking, the Whoop strap is pretty good at that. Not the best, but pretty decent. For sleep stage tracking, it's sort of second tier as well, and it also has a really good app to go with it. So the Whoop strap is one of those devices that is a good overall performer, but not absolutely outstanding at one particular thing. The best thing about it might be the app that goes with it that really interprets your data and gives you some advice. And Garmin devices are just below that, so sort of in the third tier of devices, and that includes the Enduro 3 and the Fenix 8. So okay sleep tracking, not amazing REM sleep tracking, and you might just want to use your total time in bed and total time asleep as the most reliable thing that the Enduro 3 and Fenix 8 can measure. Just to be clear, compared to just sleep stages, your total time asleep is probably the most important thing these devices can measure during the night. Also things like heart rate variability, the time you went to bed and your sleep consistency, all of these things the Enduro 3 can probably measure relatively reliably. It's just the sleep stages, so deep sleep, light sleep and REM sleep, I wouldn't rely on too much for different Garmin devices, including the Enduro 3. Still, Garmin does potentially seem to have improved over the last few years compared to some of the older devices I tested, like the Venue 3 and Epix 2. The sleep stage tracking of the Enduro 3 is actually not as bad as I expected before I started testing both the Enduro 3 and the Fenix 8. As I mentioned in my Fenix 8 video, recent Garmin watches seem to do better in my testing than older generation watches, so potentially at least there was an improvement in the sleep stage tracking somewhere over the last few years. However, this could also be a chance finding, so I'm not sure. The Enduro 3 was mostly good at detecting my deep sleep though, and less so at detecting my REM sleep, though it did detect a bit too much deep sleep on average. Still, it could have some useful information in there, but it really depends on how important sleep stage tracking is for you. Now, to close things off, let's take a look at the GPS tracking performance of the Enduro 3. And I tested this 6 times cycling to work and 6 times cycling back from work, and I cycled the exact same route each time, well, more or less the same route. And the idea here is that if the GPS tracking is very good, it should track more or less the same route each time, no matter when I cycled it. Or maybe a better way of phrasing it is, if the routes are not consistent, it's very likely that the GPS tracking is not that great. And here you can see the results for 6 times I cycled to work. Now, I always started my route on the corner right here, and as you can see, the signal was acquired quite quickly because all the green markers are close to that corner right here, so that's already looking good. But let's now look at the consistency between the routes. As you can see, there's some deviation here in the beginning, but overall looking quite good. So one time I took a slightly different route right here, but otherwise looking quite good. Up until here, there's little deviation, then for some reason here, there's more deviation. Here it's still looking okay, though again more deviation than I expected somehow. Also right here it's not looking quite as good as I'd hoped, still looking quite good. Some deviation right here, nothing terrible, but one signal always appears to be a bit off, though it's not the same signal here and here. Overall here looking quite good, still a bit more deviation than I potentially expected. Though as we zoom out, you can actually see it's quite consistent here. It's even more consistent. This part looks quite good. Also here there's some deviation. For instance, this signal right here is a bit deviating. Overall not looking that bad. Up until this point right here, it's looking quite good. Then right here, one signal deviates quite a bit, so I'm not sure why that is. For the Fenix 8 last week, it did look quite a bit better, and I used the exact same settings. So I used the auto select feature where it can automatically select some compromise between best performance and best battery life. So I could actually get probably better performance by selecting the most accurate GPS option by default, which will consume more battery life, which is all plus multiband, and I would likely get even better performance than this. I am planning to do a test in the future because it would likely have a significant impact on the performance. I just used auto select because I assumed that would be what most people would use because it's the default that is in there already and people want to conserve some battery life, but I actually don't know. What satellite option do you actually use? Well, let us know in the comments below because it also helps me with future testing. But let's now take a look at 6 times I cycled back from work to see if the results are consistent. And right here you can see the results for 6 times I cycled back from work. Now there's only 4 markers right here because 2 times I started my route right here. But in all these situations the signal was acquired quite quickly and also quite accurately, so that looks quite good. Now I did take a few different routes, but from here on out most routes are more or less the same. There is some deviation though. You can see for instance right here this signal goes a bit through the building, whereas these are a bit close to the road. Then going along the route, it actually doesn't look that bad. It looks quite good right here. Some deviation right here. This here isn't ideal, but overall still looking quite okay. Also right here, one signal deviating a bit more. This looks quite good. Here it looks quite consistent. Now I took 2 different routes here, so some deviations, but that's just because of 2 different routes. Now this is actually a bit embarrassing, but apparently for 3 out of the 6 times I tested the Enduro 3, I stopped at McDonald's. So one time right here, one time right here, and one time right here. That's why you see these big deviations, because I was stationary and I was inside, so the signal was hopping around a bit, but that's not Garmin's fault, that's my fault. So let's ignore that part. Then looking again right here where most of the signals come together, or at least 3 of them, we actually see quite a bit of deviation right here. That's not looking that amazing. Then again, here they're more consistent. So near the end, there were a few different routes I had to take because of construction work and other reasons. Overall, my impression of these signals is that it looks quite okay, though it could be better. I also have the feeling, at least, that compared to the Fenix 8 that I recently reviewed, this looks slightly worse compared to that. It's still not bad by any means, still pretty good, one of the better performances you will see, but not quite as good as I'm used to from Garmin. But I should also mention, most of my testing from Garmin includes using the All Plus multiband feature, so the best GPS tracking you can select in Garmin. And in this case, I wanted to try the auto settings, but apparently for my uses that might not be ideal. So even though this looks a tiny bit worse than what we saw for the Fenix 8, I don't actually think the Enduro 3 would do worse if I would retest it with All Plus multiband. So that test will come in the future. Overall, this is still pretty decent performance, so don't underestimate Garmin now in terms of GPS tracking. This would generally be good enough for me, but what do you think? Please let us know in the comments below. This kind of GPS tracking performance is okay, though it also surprises me a bit that it's potentially a bit worse compared to what we saw last week for the Fenix 8. Now, it's difficult to say if it's actually performing worse, and my gut feeling actually says no. I think there could be some random factors that played a part here. I could imagine, for instance, that because I had the satellite set to auto select, which is the default, that the auto selected options didn't give the best performance, and maybe for some reason on the Fenix 8 by chance auto satellite options were selected automatically. I would like to do a retest somewhere this year with both the Fenix 8 and Enduro 3, where I select the most accurate GPS option, which is All Plus multiband, and see if this significantly increases performance and if the Enduro 3 performs more like the Fenix 8. Still, the Enduro 3's performance was by no means bad, and I'm happy enough still. It just surprises me a little bit. But to conclude, is the Enduro 3 the right watch for you? Well, as always, that depends. I mentioned before that I use Garmin watches every day, and the Enduro 3 would perfectly meet my personal needs. It allows me to connect all possible sensors I need, and it has amazing battery life and good GPS. I personally don't rely on the internal heart rate sensor, and instead I just connect the Garmin HRM Pro Plus chest strap. If I were to just use it for indoor cycling and indoor running, the built-in sensor would likely suffice for me, but I just don't want to take that chance. On the other hand, though I really like the Enduro 3, some other Garmin watches would do just as well for my needs, like my somewhat older Fenix 7 Pro and Epix 2 Pro. Both of these also have very good battery life, and all sensors I have can connect to these as well. The same goes of course for the much more expensive Fenix 8, which is a powerhouse. The only reasons I would have to select the more expensive Fenix 8 over the cheaper Enduro 3 is the fact that it could get smaller sizes and also get an AMOLED screen potentially. Especially with my smaller wrist, the Enduro 3 does feel a bit oversized, though it will not be an issue for everyone. Now, I showed you the raw data, and you can of course make your own judgment if the Enduro 3 is the watch for you. Now, if you want to get sneak previews on the results, consider becoming a YouTube member by clicking the link down here. And if you do decide to get the Enduro 3, the Fenix 8, a Whoop strap, an Oura ring, an ACLeap 4, another device, or anything at all on Amazon for that matter, even something as small as toilet paper, want to support the channel and save some money, there are different affiliate links in the description below. Also, if you live in the US or Canada and you don't want to support our friend Jeffrey Bezos and becoming even richer, consider getting your sports watches from my affiliate friends at Play Better instead, and you'll also get better service. Now, thank you so much for watching, and catch you in the next video.